On your Monday episode of Locked On Raptors, stretchy bigs, anyone?
You are Locked On Raptors, your daily Toronto Raptors podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, what's going on? And welcome to another episode of Locked On Raptors, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Monday, May the 27th, and I'm your host, Sean Woodley. I've been covering the Toronto Raptors now for 10 seasons on various platforms. You can find all my work over on the Hell website at Woodley Sean. You can find the show on Instagram at Locked On Raptors. And of course, you can join us in the Locked On Raptors Discord server. The link is in the description of the podcast. It is free to join, and it's a great little community we got building around the show. We'd love to see you in there to talk playoffs, to talk draft, to talk food, all that good stuff. It's all going on in there and so much more. We got video game talk. We got WNBA talk. It's a wonderful place for sickos just like you who love the podcast. So come hang out with fellow sickos in the Discord. Again, free to join as always. Link in the description. Of course, you can find the show for free wherever you get your podcast. Follow, subscribe, rate, review on your audio app of choice. You can tell a friend as well. Word of mouth, still a good way to spread the good word about podcasts. And you can also go to YouTube and subscribe to the Locked On Raptors YouTube channel. When you do that, hit the notification bell button. And when you do that, you will get a heads up every single time the show is about to premiere or go live via push notification. A wonderful thing. So you never miss a second of that sweet, sweet Locked On Raptors action, which begins now today as we tee up a show looking at stretch bigs. This has been a draft sort of cycle, a draft season where I have certainly focused my attention largely towards wings, because I think there are a lot of really interesting wings in the range of the draft where the Raptors will be picking, of course, 19th and 31st overall, coming up in just a few weeks' time. It's very exciting. Draft coming up soon. But yeah, I've been focusing on wings. I think this team needs wings. I think, again, sort of a goal of this summer is finding a guy to slot in between RJ Barrett and Scottie Barnes who can push RJ Barrett over to the 2 and keep Scottie Barnes available as a 4 to be the sort of low man shot blocking help guy that he's very good at being. That is his best defensive role. And I don't really want to see him overextended into a situation where he's asked to be like a shutdown wing defender or anything like that. That said, you could talk me into sort of beefing up the front court for this team and giving Scottie a shot on the wing, pushing RJ to the 2, and just kind of going full size, as we've seen around the NBA, is just like a thing that is successful. If you're really big, that is good. If you're really big and skilled, oh boy, you have yourself a wonderful combination. And as we've seen in these playoffs, it seems pretty clear that if you have a bunch of differently skilled bigs, it's a pretty awesome thing, a pretty huge asset to have. It gives you stylistic versatility. It gives you just, again, the size to go and sort of flummox teams with offensive rebounding or, protect the rim with just an incredible amount of length and shot blocking acumen, et cetera, et cetera. Bigs are kind of one of the stories of these NBA playoffs, and teams having lots of them. It's proven like that's just like a real asset to have. And so, as much as I'd like the Raptors to aim for a wing where they're drafting at 19 and 31, I'd be totally fine if they took 2 wings. I do think there's a case that a big man is a pretty reasonable thing to shoot for, especially with that 19th pick, where there's some really interesting players, I think, that could still be there for the Raptors when they're up and on the clock. Guys who can sort of mesh and pair and sort of offset the skills and strengths and weaknesses of Jakob Poeltl and Kelly Olynyk, who we already know are going to be part of the big man rotation going into next year. That's a pretty good starting point to be at. I think you could use some athleticism in there. Obviously, a little extra three-point shooting never hurt anybody. And I think like switching versatility on defense is a big thing I'm looking for in a third rotation big for the Raptors as well. And that could come via free agency, but it could also come via the draft. Today, we're going to dig into 3 different guys who I think all kind of have very different skill sets, but all played as bigs in college, may play as centers in the NBA, but a couple of them might actually slide over the 4 a little bit more often, which is interesting to think about. We're going to talk about Kyle Filipowski and DaRon Holmes, who, DaRon Holmes might be like my new favorite guy in the draft. Look out, Jameer Watkins. We'll talk about them coming up, but I want to start off and talk about Kel'el Ware. If you're not familiar with Kel'el Ware, he's a 7-foot center from Indiana. Of course, the alma mater of one OG Anunoby, for those who recall. 7'4.5" wingspan, and the dude is just like an athletic freak. He is enormous. He's got incredible bounce, And again, at a 7'4.5" wingspan at 7 feet tall, he is the size that you're going to be a big man in the NBA going forward, as it's only getting bigger out there. It's only getting longer. It's only getting more Victor Wembanyama-y. And so having size to combat that is just like a really valuable thing. I don't think you can have too many 7-footers going forward, especially 7-footers who are skilled, right? I'm not talking about these big, like, sort of lunks out there who are enormous and can't move and just are big for the sake of being big, but guys who project to have stylistic versatility to how they can play defense, guys who can potentially shoot threes, which we're really going to focus on today. Like, that's just such a valuable thing to have in today's NBA, because as guys scale up and the league gets bigger, if you're big and have skill, that's going to keep you on the floor in the modern NBA. And Kel'el Ware, I think, really does fit that profile if things all break right. He is a bit of a boomer bust type of prospect, I think. But let's get into the tail of the tape on him. Right now, he's a 20th on the Ringers draft board. He's being mocked kind of in that range all over the place. Sports Illustrated, actually, in their most recent mock from a couple days ago, has the Raptors taking him at number 19. 15.9 points a game last year for Indiana in his second college season. He transferred from Oregon to Indiana. Oregon was not a great spot for him. He didn't play very well, and he kind of got branded with like a low motor tag and stuff like that. We'll get into why maybe that's not so fair anymore as a tag for him, but 15.9 a game, 9.9 boards, 1.5 assists as well, half a steal, and 1.9 blocks. Shot 61% on his twos, 42.5% on pretty low three-point volume, like 1.8 attempts a game, but 42.5%, not something you can sneeze at. Shot just 63% at the line, which is a bit of a, thing. Oh, maybe the shooting's not super real, whatever. There's reason to not think his shooting is as good as 42.5% as well. The free throws are one thing. The form is like, okay, it's not beautiful or anything like that. I'm not a shot doctor, but when you read up on people who do kind of, traffic in this stuff, there's a little bit of concern about sort of where the release point is in his hand and stuff like that. I'll actually direct you towards someone who I'm hoping to get on the show later this week. Maxwell Bombach from No Ceilings, a great place for draft coverage, has a great piece out today. I'm going to link it in the description of the podcast. You should go check out about Kel'el Ware and, sort of how he's been maybe misunderstood as a prospect and some of the things that are really exciting, intriguing about his game, some of the basic fundamental stuff he does that should make him at least like a passable NBA big, if nothing else, and some of the things that could maybe be a bit more boomer bust. But really great piece on Kel'el Ware, great context for his sort of story as a prospect to the point where he's at now. And I do think he's like a serious upside play at this part of the draft. I think, if you're looking at him and the sort of vision for him, if you're drafting him at 19, the hope is that he becomes the three-point shooting, sort of spacing big that he's flashed a little bit of ability to do in college, on top of just being a really damn good rim protector, a roll threat, a play finisher, a vertical finisher, a guy who can finish lobs. I mean, we've seen the effect that Derek Lively has had for the Mavericks. I do think there's a little bit of Derek Lively to Kel'el Ware's game, if, maybe not like the insane sort of, through the roof energy at all times that Lively seems to have. I think like the finishing, the athleticism, all that stuff is very much there for Ware. And I think as like a pair with Scottie Barnes long-term, pretty interesting potential fit as someone who can sort of learn under the tutelage of Jakob Poeltl for the next few seasons and not be thrust into action in high leverage minutes right away. I think it's pretty nice. I think pairing him next to Kelly Olynyk as a rim protector who can compensate for the defensive issues Kelly Olynyk has at the point of attack, that's also pretty interesting. I think the fully realized version of Kel'el Ware is maybe the best fitting player for the Raptors in this entire draft for what they need both now and in the future. Of course, it's all about will he actually hit on those things, and there is some volatility to the way he plays. There's also some stuff with him that's like kind of big red flag stuff. The low motor thing, I think Maxwell Bombach did a really good job in his piece kind of explaining away like the Oregon stuff that certainly applied. Didn't really feel like it was as much of a thing with Indiana this year. And so, take that for what it's worth. And there was also an element of there's this sort of perception about Ware that he kind of disappears in the second half of games. As Maxwell pointed out in his piece over at No Ceilings, that's maybe more tied to Indiana not having awesome guard play and them kind of not finding him in the second half of games. Obviously, you want to have, aggression and calling for the ball and all that stuff, but that's not really Ware's play style. He's not someone who's going to go face up and score and sort of, commandeer the offense and go make things happen. Like, he's a guy who other people are going to have to set up. And if you have bad guard play, then that's a tricky fit. I do think the potential fit with a guy like Immanuel Quickley, for example, is very intriguing. I think the potential fit of Scottie Barnes next to him long term at the 4 and 5 is absolutely intoxicating to think about if the 3-point shooting is actually real. And so, yeah, I think it's probably worth it at 19 to take the risk on Kel'el Ware if he's there. I don't think I'd be upset if he were the pick at 19. There are a lot of guys that applies for. I'm not saying they must pick him at 19 if he's there. Like, there's lots of different potential options there, and I'm not going to be too upset if it's one of like a group of 10 guys who I think we'll probably talk about by the time the draft comes around. But Ware is certainly on the list, and if they're going to go for a big, I think he's right near the top of the list for me of guys that I'd be all right with them taking a swing on. He probably doesn't last till 31 is the thing. He's being mocked anywhere around like, the mid-teens to the mid-20s. And just the potential of a guy who's 7 feet tall and can protect the rim and shoot threes, like, that's such a rare skill set. We've seen how like coveted a guy like Miles Turner's been throughout the years as a potential trade piece. We've seen, just repeat over and over again, right? Bigs who can shoot threes. It's sort of believed to be this sort of common, everyone does it skill set now in the modern NBA, but it's just not true. There's not that many guys who do it. And Kel'el Ware might be that type of guy. And even if he doesn't shoot threes, I think his finishing as like a roll man and stuff like that is still very much going to make him an NBA player. If he, kind of hits on some of the sort of the motor and all that type of stuff, those question marks that I think are maybe not super founded anyway at this point. But the stuff that takes him from pretty nice like rotation big man for a while to, oh God, like, this is a guy that every team is lusting after because he can shoot threes and protect the rim and, hang out on switches and be okay guarding in space. Although I don't think that's really a strength of his right now. He's kind of got pretty high hips. He doesn't move super well laterally. And so it will be most of like a drop big situation, I think, for him in all likelihood, at least out of the gate. But, the upside of a guy who can do that while shooting threes, that's going to make some team go, yeah, we got to take this guy in the first round. And so if they're going to take him, I think it has to be at 19. If he is the pick, I won't be so mad. And one little extra note that I think makes him a pretty interesting guy to me. He dunks real loud. I love dudes who dunk. The Raptors lost a lot of dunk sort of credibility when OG Anunoby and Precious Achiuwa were traded. And I think a guy like Kel'el Ware could go a long way to making the Raptors into a team that does dunks good again, which certainly is a sort of checkbox for me when I'm talking about guys I want to see play for the Toronto Raptors. So Kel'el Ware, super interesting. Dig into like the sort of the downside is he can only play one defensive scheme, I guess. And, the offense never quite comes around. The 3-point shooting's not there. But I do think, just athletically speaking, he's going to be in the NBA for a while. And I don't think I'm as concerned about the motor stuff. The red flag that does pop to me just before we move on, he's not a good screen setter at all, which, like, bigs who can't set screens kind of give me the willies. It's like one of my biggest basketball turnoffs. But, who better to learn from than Jakob Poeltl for the next few years? Just hammering dudes with screens and saying, hey, do it like this, Kel'el. You're all good. That's kind of fun to think about. So, yeah, Kel'el Ware, first guy we talked about today. And I, certainly think if he's the pick at 19, I will not be upset, even though, it's not a sure thing by any means that he becomes the new Miles Turner, but he could become the new Miles Turner, which would be pretty rad. We'll come back on the other side, get into another guy who plays center in college. I don't think he's going to be a center in the NBA, and that could cause a bit of a fit concern with the Raptors. We'll talk about Kyle Filipowski of Duke coming up in just one sec. Today's show is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered with over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die. You'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Back at it here on your Monday episode of Locked On Raptors, looking at a trio of bigs the Raptors could go and take at 19 and, make me feel varying ways if they did so. Wouldn't be upset about Kel'el Ware. And frankly, none of the guys we're going to talk about today, I think I would be upset about being the pick for the Raptors at number 19. I don't think any of these guys make it to 31, frankly. And we'll get into Kyle Filipowski now from Duke. Look, no one wants a Dookie on their team, but hey, sometimes they're pretty good. RJ Barrett, for example, is one. And so we got to talk about Filipowski. He was supposed to come out of the draft last year. It was kind of a surprise when he didn't. And there was even some thought when he didn't come out last year that, could he be like in contention for the number one pick next year? Obviously, he's not going to be the number one pick this season. And I think there are some pretty obvious reasons for it, but he's a good player. And at 20 years old, he's going to be 21 in November, still on the young end, still has some stuff to continue to add to his game. But this past season, Filipowski in year 2 at Duke really, I think, found a footing and, kind of made good on his decision to go back. Even though he's not going to be number one guy, I think the thinking was he might be like a late first rounder last season. He's going to probably firmly go in the middle of the first round. Hopefully, not before 19 if the Raptors really want him. But, I think he's going to be in that range of the draft for sure. He's going in the first round. 16 points a game, 8 boards, 3 assists, a steal and a block and a half on 56% from 2, 35% from 3, a big jump. He was sub 30 as a freshman, really jumped up from 3 to 35, shot 67% at the line this past season, 72% across his 2 college seasons from the line. So not incredible, not like the best indicator in the world, but I'm not super concerned. He's got some nice touch, and I think he'll be a fine free throw shooter, and the 3-point shots coming along, I think it all kind of in concert is pretty encouraging. I think for him with Kyle Filipowski, the one thing to note here, 6'11" with like a kind of negative wingspan, which is weird and probably makes it so he's not really a center in the NBA. I don't think he's going to have the sort of the size, the rim protection chops to hang as like a full-time center. Part-time, for sure. He's got the size to just like hang as a quote-unquote small ball 5. But I do think where he fits into the modern NBA is just like a kind of oversized modern playmaking 4 that in this case for the Raptors long-term, theoretically pushes Scottie Barnes to the 3. Maybe he's just like a long-term bench player. You don't worry about where he pushes Scottie Barnes and their wing answer comes from elsewhere. But I do think like a playmaking 4 is what Kyle Filipowski sort of figures to be. He can kind of do a little bit of everything on offense, right? He can handle the ball. There's a bit of a step back 3 to his game this season. He can run pick and roll, and he can also operate as the roll man who can operate at the short roll, make some pretty interesting looking passes out of those situations, can go and finish, can go and dunk, things like that. I think you can run him out of like dribble handoffs like the Raptors do with their bigs. And I think he probably has a lot more juice as a guy on keeper plays than say Jakob Poeltl does. We've seen Yak have a little bit of success there, but for the most part, the best keeper guy on the Raptors is Scottie Barnes. I think Filipowski sort of skews closer to Barnes than Poeltl as a guy who can, keep a defense on its toes with the threat of keeping those dribble handoffs and driving in for a bucket. And so, yeah, I think there's just like a lot of interesting versatility to his game. And if he's going to shoot threes like he did this past season at Duke, that makes him a super viable and kind of malleable player. You can play him with a bunch of different types of dudes. I think you could see some pretty interesting stylistic chemistry with Immanuel Quickley, for example. I think, I mentioned he's not going to be a long-term 5, but I think you could see him as like a spotlighting 5 next to, or like a moonlighting 5, whatever the word I'm looking for, something with light. Either way, Filipowski is like a 5 next to Scottie Barnes and sort of smaller looks. I think that could totally work, especially if there's enough wing talent on the team to kind of elongate those lineups and sort of prevent dribble penetration from the 2 and 3 spots. Again, RJ Barrett being on the team makes that difficult, but if you can get a more defensive-oriented 3 in there, I think those lineups become kind of interesting as a way to work Filipowski in. I think he could play with Jakob Poeltl, no problem. I think that'd be a pretty fun pairing. I think there's a real argument that there's like a little bit too much stylistic overlap with Kelly Olynyk. Some of the people who, do this thing for a living and make comps have thrown Olynyk's name out there as a comparison for Filipowski. Filipowski feels a little bit sort of more brutish and mean and powerful, I would say, than Olynyk does, who's got just like this real finesse game. Not to say there's not finesse to Filipowski's game either, but I do think he's got a little bit more sort of like all right, I'm going to like back this dude down and score and you can't stop me type of motif to his game than say Kelly Olynyk does. But yeah, I do think like the overlap of those two guys, like I'm not sure you're rolling out Filipowski Olynyk front courts all that much and hoping for good things. Because again, I don't think Filipowski's like the rim protector who's going to cover up for the issues of Olynyk at the four and vice versa. And so it's a bit of an interesting fit there. That said, should you be making draft picks of 20-year-olds with the sort of consideration of fit with your bench bigs in mind? Probably not. Just take the best guy. And if they think Filipowski's the best guy, you can go and do that just fine. And, 2 years from now, Olynyk won't be on the team anymore. And so Filipowski just kind of steps into that role. Maybe that's the succession plan, right? Maybe you don't draft Filipowski with the expectation he's going to go and be a starter down the line. Maybe he's your long-term way to ensure you still have that playmaking four off the bench that Kelly Olynyk figures to be. I think that's a perfectly fine way and strategy to approach this pick with, even though it may be kind of, hints at sort of a lower upside and all of that. I do think of the three guys we're talking about today between Ware, Filipowski, and DaRon Holmes, who we'll get to in a second. I think Filipowski has the lowest ceiling of them all, but he might have the highest floor, honestly. Like he's just going to be a good player who connects lineups, ties things together, keeps second units flowing at the very least, I think, long term. How much he can kind of be a staple of an offense, like a second or third option to kind of tie things together and create stuff is, I think, an open question. But he's got a pretty nice handle for a guy of his size. And the playmaking chops are pretty real. I think he's got some post-up juice, things like that. I'm pretty into it. Defensively, I think he's got like good footwork and smarts. I think that's going to overcome the lack of just raw size that he has. Again, like kind of, I think someone in the Discord yesterday referred to him as T-Rex arms Filipowski, which like, he's still got a 6'11" wingspan. It's not like he's walking out there with, little Isaiah Thomas arms or anything like that. But no, he's not got that sort of 7'5" wingspan you'd hope from a 6'11" center in the modern NBA. And that's going to affect his ability to block shots. It'll also affect his ability to like finish around the rim as a center as well, which is again why I think playing further away from the basket is like a spacing playmaking four is probably his destiny in the NBA, where that's a little bit more mitigated. And so, yeah, he's not going to be like a great defender or anything like that, but I do think he's going to just be like a really good, reliable player to have in who's not going to be someone who gets targeted all that much. He's still 6'11", right? Like he's still big. He still takes up a ton of space. And so, yeah, maybe like a guard will, try to seek out switches and attack him in high leverage moments. Sure. Like that happens to a lot of bigs. It happens to the best of the bigs as well. And it doesn't always go super well. Ask Rudy Gobert. But like, doesn't mean you can't be a good passable defender. And as the league, I think, skews further away from targeted mismatch hunting in the regular season, at least, obviously, it's been kind of the whole story in the playoffs, especially in this Mavericks series. But, I do think we're seeing a bit of a skewing away from targeted mismatch hunting in the regular season and more sort of, of leaning into system ball and cohesive basketball, things like that. I think he can get by and be like a neutral defender, maybe even a slight positive with his smarts and things like that. So I don't think it's like a concern that he's going to be some sort of pylon out there. I think he competes super hard. He's got a really high motor from what it looks like. He's got a bit of MFer to him, which I always like. And, I guess like that's sort of part and parcel with being a main guy on Duke is you always kind of have like MFer sometimes in a bad context and bad connotation. But I think in Filipowski's case, like the dude just kind of seems like he's out there to kind of ruin everyone's day when he's playing. And that's something you want on your team. I do think, again, he's not going to be there past at 31 if the Raptors really want him. I think they'll have to jump at him at 19 because I just think he's the type of guy who's going to be like a nice high-end role player for a very long time that teams are always going to covet. I think a lot of teams in the Raptors range that are like closer to contention could really use a guy like Filipowski. I'm thinking about like Philly, for example, throwing him in as the 4 long-term next to Joel Embiid with Tyrese Maxey out there, especially if they go and find themselves a wing. Like, I think that's pretty interesting. I think, Embiid covers for his defensive deficiencies and having that extra bit of playmaking from a forward spot would be really interesting for a team like Philly. That's just one team that I'm throwing out there, but I do think Filipowski is the kind of guy that's going to be on good teams and is going to be like a useful piece for good teams for a long time. He's probably not my favorite option for the Raptors at 19, just because I think the overlap with Scottie Barnes is kind of a concern. And again, pushing Scottie to the 3 long term, I'm not like a huge fan of. And if you're not drafting a guy to hopefully be a starter at 19, which, you know, I guess that's sort of the fringe of like, are you hoping to get a starter out of this? I think you're always hoping to get a starter when you draft, but you got to be realistic too. But I do think there are a couple of guys who kind of have higher upsides as potential starters with reasonable floors as well that we can get into, especially the guy coming up next, who I think I'd rather at 19 for the Raptors. But I wouldn't be upset if Filipowski were the guy because I just think he's a good basketball player who knows what he's doing out there and can offer some interesting little wrinkles to the Raptors offense, some creation away from Scottie Barnes and Immanuel Quickley that can be helpful. But yeah, I think of the three guys we talked about today, or will talk about today, probably the third guy I'd have at 19 among my favorite targets for the Raptors, but certainly wouldn't be upset because, again, I think he's just a good ball player. We'll come back on the other side, talk about a guy who might just be my new favorite guy in this draft, period. I love him. DaRon Holmes II coming up in just one sec. All right, let's wrap it up here with a look at DaRon Holmes II from Dayton. 21 years old, 6'9" with a 7.5-inch wingspan. Turns 22 before the season starts, so a little bit older than Ware or Filipowski. Played 3 years at Dayton and was just awesome for the Flyers this past season. Averaged 20 points, 8.5 boards, 2.5 assists, 0.9 steals, and 2.1 blocks in his junior season. And I just like, there's so much about DaRon Holmes' game that I like. Can't even decide where to start. Let's start with, I guess, just like the offensive package. Took a really big shooting jump this past season. Was a kind of a non-shooter, like a super non-shooter in his first season in college. Kind of jumped up a little bit in year two. Shot 38.6% on 2.5 attempts a game this past year for Dayton. So it's still very small sample. We're talking like 70, 80 attempts here. It's not a ton. I guess like 100 maybe if you kind of do the full math on it. But you know, shooting 38.6%, pretty nice. He did it in a lot of different ways, mostly like catch and shoots and pick and pops and stuff like that. Maybe not a lot of different ways. That's kind of the way he shoots his threes, is pick and pops. But, you know, that's not a bad thing to have, a guy who can give you popping and rolling, which DaRon Holmes can absolutely do. Pretty fascinating stuff. He's like a post-up monster. And as someone who, you know, listeners to this podcast know, love me some Pascal Siakam. I love a dude who's a really good post scorer, and DaRon Holmes can absolutely go and cook dudes in the post. He's got a nice little array of finishes, drop steps, things like that. Really think that's a fun, you know, sort of part of his offensive game. And I think in general, like, he just kind of scores in a bunch of different ways. He can score as a roller. He can score as a popper. He can score as a catch and shoot guy. He can, when it swings to him on the catch, he can pump fake and usually get a guy out of his shoes because he's got a really nice looking pump fake and drive and score that way. There's even a couple instances on his tape of him kind of just like taking dudes from a standstill off the bounce and getting to the rim, although I don't think that's really going to be a huge part of his game in the NBA. Definitely think he profiles more as play finisher than play creator. And we'll get into some of the reasons for that as well later on. But overall, just like a super versatile offensive package. He is, I think, a nice transition finisher as well. And a nice thing, let's sort of a little subtle wrinkle about his game. The dude is just always shot ready. The dude is always presenting himself as a target, whether it's as a roller, always got the hand up, always there presenting himself to the guard, whether it's in transition where he's just like constantly running, hand up, ready to make plays and make catches. You know, on the perimeter, relocating for threes, always kind of in the position with the shooting pocket ready to go, ready to fire a three if it swings to him. You know, there's just like a lot of sort of smarts to his game, it seems, like a pretty good feel for things on the offensive end and where he can kind of get his looks from, on top of just sort of the bruising post game that he has, which is super fun. The interesting thing about him is I don't think he's going to be playing the same position he played in college in the NBA. And I think a lot of the stuff with his defense in particular is kind of a little mystery box because he was asked so much at Dayton to be like a drop big. He was their center in most iterations that he played. And on offense, that made him like a screener, diver, popper type guy a lot of the time. And on defense, he was playing like a traditional drop a lot of the time. And look, he was very good at it. Two plus blocks a game, and like pretty highlight reel level stuff from him as a shot blocker around the rim as well. But he's 6'9". His wingspan's over 7 feet tall. He's a pretty slender guy, and I think he's pretty quick with his feet. I kind of think there's a perimeter defender in DaRon Holmes, and I don't know if he got a ton of leeway to really do it in college, but when I watch him and I see the sort of slipperiness he can kind of have as like a screen navigator and stuff, I don't want to like invoke one of the best defenders in basketball, but like Jaden McDaniels comes to mind a little bit. Just with, again, how quick and nimble he is at a pretty ridiculous size for a guy to be that quick and nimble. I kind of think that's where Holmes's future is as a defender. I don't necessarily think it's as a traditional drop big. I don't think he's got the size for that really in the NBA. You know, he's playing in the Atlantic 10. You know, that's another sort of knock on him is the quality of competition wasn't incredible. And there are a couple examples on his tape of him just clearly dwarfing and demolishing guys who have no business ever playing up against a future NBA player. And it's pretty remarkable. We'll get into some of those in a sec. But I do think defensively, like a 3-4 sort of wingy type is the role for him, especially if the 3-point shooting is real. If he's a 38% 3-point shooter at that size with that athleticism, he's a wing to me. And you know, the guy who he sort of invokes for me is second half of 21-22 Precious Achiuwa. Like if only he could have maintained that. Really nice defender, has some rim protection chops, but really where he shines is on the perimeter. You know, and sort of assumes more of a wing type role on offense. I think that's there for DaRon Holmes. And I would love to see him get the shot to do that with the Raptors as someone who, as we've talked about, like helps to take some of that wing defense burden away from Scottie Barnes, but they can flip flop, right? Scottie can go take wing assignments. DaRon Holmes can be your low help rim protector, where he's very good as well and has just like really great shot blocking instincts and a second jump that's absolutely off the freaking charts. There is one clip from his college season this past year at Dayton where DaRon Holmes is guarding. He gets switched onto a guard. The guard is in the right corner. And so they're playing Fordham. So, like, not exactly NBA quality talent on Fordham, but bear with me here. He gets switched onto a guard, and the guard sort of backpedals into the corner to try to pull up for three. He pump fakes. DaRon Holmes bites at it. He jumps crazy high in the air and lands. And then as he lands, the dude tries to actually put up the three. And the second jump from Holmes, it's like a split millisecond. It's unbelievable. It's like it shouldn't happen. And like it shouldn't, like Achilles shouldn't be made this way. But they are apparently for DaRon Holmes. And he gets up and he absolutely ruins this guy's day, sends the shot into the first row. And it's thrilling stuff. It's just like there's some serious defensive potential, I think, that hasn't been tapped into with Holmes, with him playing largely as a big. And so, you know, it's maybe a risk to say, hey, this guy excelled at this one thing at defense. It's about, you know, this is something that, you know, that the scouting staff would really have to be sort of sure and pounding the table for, like this guy can play on the wing. But I do think it's there, you know, despite it not being the way he played defense in college, just watching the tape, like there's a wing defender here in DaRon Holmes. And if he's a wing defender, man, oh man, that is a valuable player because of all the different ways he can score as a play finisher. Like I said, I don't think he's much of like a creator. You know, there's a little bit of, you know, stuff where he can kind of pass it of post-ups and things like that. But I mostly view those possessions where he makes those nice like cross-court skip passes and things like that to kind of pass out of those double teams. To me, that more just like validates the decision to funnel those possessions to him in the post. Like he can do that and not get overwhelmed by doubles and kind of derail the offense. I don't think that portends necessarily him being like an on-ball creator. I think the handle's a little bit loose. I don't think there's like the sort of passing chops of seeing all the different reads that are there in all the different facets of playing offense. Like rarely ever ran pick and roll or anything like that. Almost never, right? So I think for the most part, you're looking at Holmes as like, you know, again, play finishing, connective type player who can make, you know, the nice passes here and there to kind of keep the offense flowing, can pass out of the places where you're going to sort of go to him in the post and not get totally bogged down, but not someone who's going to profile as like a higher upside creation guy, which like none of the guys we've talked about today really are. Filipowski may be the closest thing to that, but I think you're talking about pure role players here. And DaRon Holmes, just like the physical profile, the athleticism, the package he has as an offensive scorer, the, you know, again, the post game, love that post game, man. The dunks, also dunks. He's got the high motor, all of that stuff. The great second leap feels like a really, really nice role player to me. If you can tap into him as like a 4 or a 3 on the defensive end, and even on offense, right? think that's where he's going to have to settle in, and the three-point shooting is going to have to be real. The concern is that the three-point shooter is just not real, right? And if that's not real, then he becomes like a pretty sort of tough guy to place. Small ball tweener center is kind of where he's at if he can't actually shoot threes. But I think the form looks good to my sort of untrained eye and all of that. And I think it's probably worth it to at least bet on him. At 19, I think I would be pretty thrilled if he were the pick at 19, just for the possibilities, just for the ways he could elongate and connect the Raptors lineups to cover up for some of the weaknesses that exist on the team. And again, you're betting on a couple things there, right? You're betting on him actually having on-ball chops as a perimeter defender, which I think he does. And you're betting on the three-point shot being real, which who the hell knows? But I think some of the indicators are very nice. He shot, 71% at the line. That's not terrible. It's, kind of where you want it to be as like an indicator at the very low end, at least over 70% is a nice place to be if you're trying to infer three-point shooting upside and touch from free throw percentage. But overall, really, really like DaRon Holmes. I really like his potential fit with Scottie Barnes and Immanuel Quickley. And so for me, move over Jameer Watkins, baby. DaRon Holmes, my new quote unquote favorite guy, capital F, capital G for the Raptors at number 19. We'll examine him a little bit more going forward, I'm sure. But yeah, I'm pretty in on DaRon Holmes, man. He's fun as hell. And just the athleticism, the length, the shot blocking, it's all a pretty fun little package that he brings to the table. Do it, man. I'm all in. All right. We'll leave it there. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's show. We'll be back again tomorrow. I'm hoping, like I said, Maxwell Bombach from No Ceilings, hoping to get him on the show at some point this week. Could be as early as tomorrow. We're still working on scheduling stuff, but looking forward to talking with him there. If we can get something on the books, and we'll have other draft stuff too. We'll have other off-season look aheads. Jamar Hines, Katie Heindel will be along. Our pal Big Vivek Jacob is currently traveling for the Cricket World Cup, so you won't hear from him for a few weeks, but we'll get him back on and we'll do our over-unders review once he's back from his travels down in the States covering the World Cup as well. So lots to come as we continue. There's less than a month to the draft now, man. It's very exciting stuff. We'll be here covering it all for you here on the show. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will talk to you again on Tuesday, another episode of Locked On Raptors. In the meantime, follow, subscribe, rate, review, tell a friend, all the good stuff. And go check out Locked On Sports Today 24/7, our all-day streaming channel covering all the biggest stories in sports with the local experts of the Locked On Podcast Network, giving you that insight you can only get from those who spend as much time talking about their teams as we do. With that, thank you so much for hanging out. Talk to you Tuesday. Bye-bye.